A frostbitten woman clawed at the doctor's gate, choking, "Save the baby first." The baby wasn't crying. That was the first thing I noticed. You'd think it would be the blood, or the cold, or the way her fingers had gone the color of creek ice where she'd been clawing at the gate. But it was the silence. A newborn on a January night in that country ought to be screaming. There was nothing. Just the wind off the Powder River and the creak of the gate post and the sound of her breathing, ragged, wet, barely there. I'd been sleeping in the stable. Doc Hargrove had let me bed down there 3 nights running in exchange for splitting his wood, and I wasn't in any hurry to move on. I had nowhere to move on to. That's the honest truth of where I was that winter, not traveling somewhere, just drifting away from everything I'd known. Fort Reno was behind me. My mother's people were behind me. 12 years of scouting for the Army and the particular kind of emptiness that work carves into a man were all behind me. And in front of me there was just more plain, more cold, more nothing. I heard her hit the gate, not a knock, a weight falling against it. I came out of the straw with my knife already in my hand, which tells you something about how I'd been living. Stepped out of the stable into maybe 8 inches of new snow, the kind that falls so dry and fine it barely crunches, and saw her in the gap between the fence posts where she'd managed to push the latch up before her legs went. She was on her knees in the snow, one hand still on the gate, the other arm wrapped around something against her chest. I crossed to her in maybe 4 strides. She looked up at me, and I want to be careful here, because I've told this wrong before. People here, she looked up at him, and they picture a helpless woman and a man arriving to save her. That's not what I saw. What I saw was a woman who had made it, who had gotten herself and that child out of whatever had happened to them and across however many miles of January plain and to this gate. Her face was half frozen, and her lips were cracked through and bleeding, and her eyes were the color of creek ice, same as her fingers, but they were open. They were tracking. When she looked up at me, she wasn't asking me to save her. She was telling me to. "The baby," she said, 2 words, almost no sound behind them. I took the child from her arms, had to peel her fingers loose one by one. She was holding on that hard, and she sagged sideways into the snow, and I kicked the gate open with my foot and started shouting for Hargrove. His name was Nathaniel, the baby. I didn't know that yet. I found it out later, and by then it already felt like something I'd always known. Hargrove came out in his nightshirt with a lamp, took one look, and we got her inside. The baby was alive, barely, but alive. That particular gray-blue of a newborn who'd been too cold too long. And Hargrove went to work on both of them while I stood in the corner of his examining room and watched, and tried to figure out what to do with my hands. I'm not a man who cries. That's not shame, just fact. 12 years of what I'd seen had dried something out in me that didn't come back easily. But I stood in that corner with her blood on my forearms from where I'd carried her, and I felt something pulling in my chest that I didn't have a name for. Not grief exactly. Not fear. Something older than either of those. Hargrove looked back at me once while he was working and said, "You can wait outside, Joseph." I didn't move. He didn't ask again. Her name was Clara Birch. Hargrove knew of her. She'd come out from Pennsylvania 2 years prior with her husband, a man named Birch who'd taken a homestead claim 12 miles northeast of town on the flat ground above the river bend. Hargrove had delivered the baby there 6 weeks before, or meant to. He'd been turned back by weather, and by the time the road cleared she'd already delivered alone, she and the baby both fine. That's what he'd heard anyway, from a freight driver passing through. What had happened in the weeks since, I pieced together over the next few days from the things she said and the things she didn't. Her husband had gone to town for supplies in early December and not come back. She'd waited 2 weeks. The baby had been born 3 weeks premature and small, and she'd kept him alive through the first cold snap by sheer force of staying awake and keeping him against her skin. When the wood ran out, she'd started burning furniture. When the furniture was gone, she'd started thinking about what 12 miles in January would mean, and she'd waited another week past the point of thinking about it before she'd finally bundled the baby into her coat and started walking. She'd been walking 4 days when she found Hargrove's gate. I've scouted in winter. I know that country in January, know the way the cold sets into you past the point of feeling it, know the particular hallucination that comes when your body starts shutting down, know how many men I've found in the spring who'd laid down in the snow and gone to sleep. 4 days, with a 6-week-old infant. I've tried to find the word for what that is and I can't. Stubbornness doesn't touch it. Neither does courage. It's something more animal than either and more human at the same time. I stayed. I told myself it was because Hargrove needed the help. He had 2 other patients that week, a trapper with a badly set leg and an old woman from town with a lung ailment, and he couldn't watch all of them and cook and haul water. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that I hadn't felt anything in so long that I was afraid if I walked away from whatever was happening in that house, I'd lose the thread entirely. She was awake on the 3rd day. Not well, her feet were frostbitten enough that Hargrove was still watching 2 of the toes on her right foot, but awake and clear and asking questions in the voice of a woman who'd been through something, and come out the other side with more information about herself than she'd had before. That kind of voice. I'd heard it before on men after battles. Never on a woman lying in a sick bed in a frontier doctor's house with a newborn in a bureau drawer she'd lined with blankets. "You're the one who carried me in," she said. I was putting wood in the stove, didn't turn around. "Yes." "And the baby?" "Yes." A pause, the wood settling. "Thank you." I turned around then. She was looking at me the way she'd looked at me at the gate, not like a woman who'd been saved, but like a woman who was taking stock of something, measuring, deciding. "He's eating," she said, which was what she wanted me to know. "The baby. 6 weeks old and premature and 4 days in January cold, and he was eating." Hargrove said, "What's your name?" "Joseph Tall Horse." She nodded, just nodded like that answered more than just the name. "You're Lakota." My mother was Oglala Lakota. My father was a scout out of Fort Laramie. I've been both things and not quite either one for most of my life. I don't know why I told her that. I hadn't said that out loud to anyone in maybe 2 years. She looked at me for a long time. The lamp was between us and her face was still hollowed out from the walking, the cold still not quite gone from the dark patches on her cheekbones. "That sounds like a hard way to live," she said. "It is. So does spending 12 years scouting for an army that doesn't think much of your mother's people." I put the last piece of wood in the stove and closed it. "How do you know about that?" "Hargrove talks," she said. "Not unkind, just a fact." I sat down in the chair by the window. Outside the snow had started again, fine and dry, coming down in the lamplight. "You walked 4 days in January with a 6-week-old baby," I said. "You want to tell me that's not a hard way to live either?" Something moved in her face. Not a smile exactly, something past it. "Harder than I knew I could do," she said. "I wasn't sure the first day. I thought I almost turned back, but there was nothing to go back to." "So you kept going?" "I kept going." We sat with that for a while. The stove ticked. The baby made a small sound in his bureau drawer bed and then went quiet. "Where were you going?" she asked. "Before?" "Nowhere in particular." "How long had you been going nowhere in particular?" I looked at her. She wasn't asking to be pointed or unkind. She was asking because she genuinely wanted to know, the way people ask when they're paying real attention, when you're a person to them and not a background. "About a year," I said. She nodded again, slow. "What happened a year ago?" "My last patrol lost 3 men in an ambush I should have seen coming." I stopped, started again, started thinking maybe the things I was good at weren't worth being good at. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "The things you're good at got me and my son into this house." I didn't answer that. "Joseph," She said my name like she'd been using it a long time. That's not nothing. Her husband never came back. Hargrove heard in February from a man who'd been in Casper that Birch had gotten into a card game, gotten drunk, gotten into a fight over the card game, and gotten himself shot. He'd been buried in Casper before Christmas. Nobody had known there was a woman and a baby waiting on a homestead 12 miles out. Nobody had thought to send word. I was the one who told her. I'd thought about letting Hargrove do it, but it seemed wrong somehow. She'd talked to me. I'd talked to her. It seemed like something that ought to pass between people who'd already sat in a room together in the dark. She took it the way she'd taken everything else, straight on, without flinching, with a stillness that had some grief in it, but more of that particular quality I'd been watching in her for 3 weeks now. Not hardness. Something better than hardness. A woman who had already learned what she could survive. After a while she said, "I thought as much." "I'm sorry." "So am I." A pause. "What's in Casper, do you know?" "I've never been." "Not much." "What about east? I have a sister in Nebraska." "Better country than here. Warmer anyway." She was quiet. The baby was in her lap now, awake and blinking at the lamp. She'd started calling him Nathaniel. "You said you were drifting," she said. "East, south, which way?" "I haven't decided." She looked up from the baby. "You could come as far as Nebraska," she said, "if you were going that direction anyway." I looked at her. "I have a wagon," she said, "and a horse if someone can go out to the homestead and bring them back. I have the baby. I don't know the country east of here." "I know it." "I know you know it." There was something very plain in the way she said it, no pretense in it. She was a woman alone with a baby in February, and she needed to get to Nebraska, and she was asking a man she'd known 3 weeks, straight out, no circles around it. But it wasn't only that. I'd spent enough time in that house by then to know it wasn't only that. "It's a long way," I said. "I've walked longer." We left on the 9th of February. Hargrove gave us what he could spare: salt, coffee, a spare blanket. The horse was a thick-necked gray mare who'd come through the winter better than she had any right to. I rode her out to the homestead and loaded the wagon and led her back to Hargrove's, and we set out east in the early morning with the sky still orange at the edges. She sat on the wagon bench with Nathaniel in his bundle against her chest, the reins in both hands, her eyes on the flat ground ahead. I rode alongside on the mare. We didn't talk much that first day. Didn't need to. There's a kind of quiet that 2 people build together over weeks of small tasks and small hours, and we'd built it already. Around midday we stopped by a creek to water the horse. She got down from the wagon and I helped her, which was the first time I'd touched her since the gate, since I'd peeled her fingers loose from the baby and carried her across Hargrove's yard. She stepped down and her hand was in mine for maybe 3 seconds, and then she was on the ground and walking to the creek bank. But I felt it in my chest, the same way I'd felt it that first night. That pulling, that thread. Nathaniel woke up and she sat on a flat rock by the water and fed him, and I stood a little way off with my back turned, which was the courtesy you give, and listened to the creek running under the last of the ice. "You don't have to stand with your back to me," she said. "I don't mind." I turned around and sat down on a rock a few feet away. She looked up. "Do you want children?" It's the kind of question that would have been strange from anyone else. From her, it was just a question. She'd earned the right to ask plain questions. "I don't know," I said. I hadn't thought about it in a long time. "Why not?" Seemed like I stopped, tried to find the honest words. Seemed like the life I was living didn't have room for it. "What about the life you're living now?" I looked at her across the few feet between us. The creek was running, and Nathaniel was making his small sounds, and the sky had gone high and pale and clear the way it does in February when the cold breaks for a day. "That might be different," I said. She held my eyes for a moment, then she looked back down at the baby. "Good," she said quietly. The days took on a shape. Up before light, the fire made coffee, the wagon moving by the time the sky went gray. I scouted ahead out of habit, old muscle memory from 12 years of it, reading the ground, checking creek crossings, watching the horizon. She watched me do it and didn't comment, which meant she understood what it was. A few times I'd come back to the wagon and she'd have spotted something I'd missed, a change in the cloud cover, a track in the mud near a crossing, and she'd mention it matter-of-factly, no fuss about it, just information passed between people traveling together. The third night out, we camped in the shelter of a limestone shelf with a good overhang against the wind. I made a fire deeper in under the rock, and she fed the baby and we ate, and she fell asleep sitting up, her back against the rock wall, Nathaniel in his bundle. I sat up a while after, watched the fire. I thought about the men I'd lost on that last patrol. I thought about the 12 years. I thought about the particular look my commanding officer had given me when I'd come back alone, and what he'd said, and the way he'd said it, and I thought about the year of walking away from everything. Thought about the morning I'd ended up in Hargrove's stable with nowhere else to go. Then I thought about 8 inches of dry January snow, and a woman coming out of it on her knees with a child held against her chest, holding on. There's a thing that happens when you've been around long enough. You start to recognize the things that are real. The things that aren't performance, aren't angle, aren't strategy. Just real. A woman walking 4 days in January with a 6-week-old baby and no guarantee of anything at the end of it because there was nothing to go back to. That's real. That's the realest thing I'd seen in 12 years of scouting, and I'd seen a lot. I looked at her sleeping against the rock wall, the baby against her chest, the fire throwing its light across her face. I thought, I don't want to drift anymore. That was all, not a plan, not a revelation, just, I don't want to drift anymore, I want to be somewhere, I want to be this, here, whatever this is. 2 days out of Nebraska she got sick. Not serious, a cold, a fever, the kind of thing the body picks up when you've pushed it past what it should do and then asked a little more. She didn't complain about it. I noticed because her voice changed and because she was moving slower getting on and off the wagon. That evening I made camp early and made her get into the back of the wagon with Nathaniel and the blankets, and I did the evening work alone, the horse, the fire, the water. When I brought her the coffee, she looked up at me from the blankets. "I can do it," she said. "I know you can. You don't have to." "Clara," I held the coffee out, "drink this." She looked at me for a moment. Then she took it. Her fingers were warm this time, no creek ice in them, just skin, and they closed around mine for a second before she took the cup. "You're going to stay," she said, "not a question." "In Nebraska." She kept her eyes on me. "After Nebraska, you're not going to leave." I sat down on the tailgate. The fire was going, the plain was dark around us, Nathaniel was making his small sleeping sounds. "I haven't been asked to stay anywhere in a long time," I said. "I'm asking." "I know. Is that enough?" I thought about it honestly. About what I'd been, about what 12 years does to a man, about what a year of walking away does on top of that, about what it would mean to stop, to have somewhere that was somewhere. "Yes," I said, "that's enough." She nodded slow, the way she nodded when something settled for her. She wrapped both hands around the coffee. The lamplight inside the wagon was yellow and close. "Your mother's people," she said after a while. Will that be difficult? What you are and what I am." "There are people who will make it difficult," I said. "There always are. But I stopped living my life around those people a long time ago." Something in her face eased, just a fraction. "Good," she said, the same word she'd said at the creek in the same quiet way. I sat on the tailgate until the fire burned low. She fell asleep with the coffee cup still in her hands, and I took it from her and covered her and went back to the fire. The plain was enormous and dark and cold, and I sat in it and felt, for the first time in a year, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We came into her sister's town on a Thursday, late afternoon, the light going copper and flat over the frozen fields. Her sister was a woman named Margaret, married to a dry goods merchant, good people. They came out of the house when they heard the wagon and Margaret stopped in the yard. When she saw Clara and her face did what faces do when something that was feared as lost comes walking back. They held each other in the yard for a long time. I stayed with the wagon and the horse. Nathaniel was awake in his bundle on the seat, blinking at the copper light, his breath a small white cloud. I put my finger against his palm the way I'd been doing on the trail when he was fussy, and he closed his hand around it, which is what he always did. Margaret's husband came out and shook my hand and said my name correctly, which not everyone did, and said there was room in the barn if I needed it and supper when I was ready. Clara came back from her sister. She had Margaret's color in her face now, the warmth of the yard and the reunion, and she looked not different from the woman I'd been traveling with, but more of herself, more filled in, like the last 3 weeks had been the distance between almost and here. She stood in front of me in the yard. "You'll stay for supper," she said. "Yes." "And after that?" "Yes." She reached up and touched the side of my face with one hand, just her palm against my jaw a moment, her eyes on mine. In them was everything she didn't need to say, that she'd known what she was doing when she asked me to come, that she was not a woman who asked things by accident, that she'd meant it at the gate and at the creek and in the wagon in the lamplight, and she meant it now. "Good," she said, the third time. Always the same word. I put my hand over hers where it rested on my jaw, felt the warmth of it, the steadiness. This woman who had walked 4 days through January with nothing but the will to make it and had made it, and then, once she was safe, had looked at a man who was drifting toward nothing and decided he was worth keeping. I don't have a word for what that is, what it does to a man, to be seen like that, not despite what you are, not in spite of the hard things, but because of them, because of all of it. 12 years and the men I lost and the year of drifting and the half and half of what I am. All of it seen and none of it turned away from. A good woman. That's what people say, and they mean it easy, but they don't always know what they're saying. A good woman is one who chooses clearly, who sees clearly, who, when she decides something, means it down to the bone. She meant it. The light was going down behind the frozen fields. Inside the house, Margaret was already moving around, making noise, getting supper. Nathaniel had fallen back to sleep with my finger in his fist. I was somewhere. I was exactly where I was supposed to be.